Something does not quite fit about the old picture of Ice Age Europe. The farther east one travels from the caves of western France and Spain, the stranger the story becomes. In the Crimean Peninsula, positioned between the Black Sea, the Caucasus, and the great grasslands of Eurasia, archaeologists uncovered burials, ochre, carefully shaped stone tools, and human skeletons that refused to behave like the textbook image of isolated Neanderthals struggling through a frozen wilderness. The people of Crimea looked different. Their faces were often less massive, their bodies less extreme, and their behaviour carried hints of planning, symbolism, and social traditions that appear disturbingly early. What if the old labels placed upon these individuals were never accurate in the first place? What if the peninsula, long treated as a remote side chapter of human evolution, was actually one of the central meeting grounds of ancient Eurasia, where populations mixed, technologies spread, and some of the earliest burial traditions in Europe took shape far earlier than the standard timeline allows? Crimea has always occupied an uncomfortable position in discussions of early humans because it sits directly across the pathways that connected the eastern Mediterranean to the northern plains. During warm climatic phases, when forests expanded and rivers opened long green corridors across Eurasia, this region was not isolated at all. Herds of horse, bison, deer, and mammoth moved through these routes continuously, followed by predators and human hunting groups. The peninsula functioned less like a dead end and more like a bridge between worlds. Yet much of the 20th century treated Crimea as a strange holding zone where archaic humans survived in partial isolation while the supposedly real story unfolded elsewhere. That interpretation began to fracture as more fossils, tools, and habitation sites were uncovered. The deeper researchers looked into Crimea, the harder it became to preserve the image of a marginal population cut off from wider human networks. The bodies themselves create the first serious problem. Many Crimean skeletons have traditionally been placed into vague categories such as interglacial Neanderthals or pre-classic Neanderthals, labels that sound technical but often conceal uncertainty rather than resolve it. These individuals frequently lacked the extreme facial projection and massive skeletal proportions associated with the later cold-adapted Neanderthals of Western Europe. Their limb proportions were often more balanced. Their skull architecture sometimes appeared unexpectedly gracile. Their anatomy carried traits that seemed intermediate between later European Neanderthals and the early Homo sapiens populations of the Levant. Once these similarities are recognized, the traditional evolutionary sequence begins to feel suspiciously neat, almost as though the fossils were forced into a predetermined storyline. The chronology only deepens the mystery. Around 130,000 to 80,000 years ago, warm interglacial conditions transformed large sections of Eurasia into highly productive environments. Sea levels shifted, forests spread northward, and migration corridors opened across regions that later became hostile during colder phases. In the Levant, sites such as School Cave and Kafsa Cave preserve some of the earliest known burials associated with Homo sapiens. Bodies were deliberately positioned, ochre was applied, symbolic behavior was already emerging. These populations were neither primitive nor experimental. They displayed flexibility, planning depth, and social traditions that resemble much later human communities. Yet, the standard narrative insists these populations remain trapped within the Levant, unable to move farther into Eurasia despite ideal climatic conditions and wide-open corridors leading directly toward Anatolia, the Black Sea region, and southeastern Europe. That assumption becomes difficult to defend once Crimea enters the picture. Geographically, the peninsula sits exactly where traces of northward movement from the Levant should appear. It lies along a natural route connecting the eastern Mediterranean with the Pontic steppe and the interior of Europe. During warm periods, these pathways were not frozen wastelands. They were habitable, fertile, and rich in game. Human movement through such corridors was inevitable. The suggestion that early Homo sapiens somehow halted permanently at the Levantine boundary begins to feel biologically implausible once the wider geography is taken seriously. The burial site of Kiik-Koba, stands at the center of this controversy. Excavations uncovered an adult human intentionally placed within a prepared pit, the body carefully positioned with flexed limbs. Nearby rested the burial of an infant. Red ochre appeared directly associated with the site. None of this resembles accidental deposition or random disposal of the dead. It speaks of ritualized behavior, social memory, and deliberate symbolic action. Such behavior carries enormous implications because it aligns remarkably closely with the burial traditions already visible farther south in the Levant during the same interglacial period. The standard explanation attempts to preserve separation between these worlds. The Levantine burials belong to Homo sapiens, while Kiik-Koba is assigned to Neanderthals. Case closed. But that neat division depends entirely upon the assumption that anatomy maps cleanly onto identity and behavior. Modern genetics shattered that assumption years ago. Every Neanderthal genome examined contains traces of older Homo sapiens ancestry. Their mitochondrial lineages show evidence of replacement through earlier contact with sapiens-related populations. Their Y chromosome lineages display the same pattern. By 100,000 years ago, there were no untouched populations anywhere in Western Eurasia. There were only mixtures of ancestry, shaped by repeated episodes of contact, stretching across immense spans of time. Once that reality is acknowledged, the Crimean fossils begin to appear less like primitive Neanderthals and more like populations existing within a broad Eurasian interaction zone. Their gracile anatomy no longer represents an incomplete stage of Neanderthal evolution. Instead, it starts to resemble evidence of admixture and ecological adaptation within interconnected populations, moving across the eastern Mediterranean and southeastern Europe. The stone tools strengthen this interpretation. Crimea belongs to the wider distribution of the Micoquian tradition, one of the most distinctive technological systems of the Middle Paleolithic world. Micoquian toolkits were not simple disposable implements. They were heavily maintained, repeatedly sharpened, and often carried across long distances. Their forms remained remarkably standardized across enormous regions extending from Central Europe to the Black Sea and into parts of Eastern Eurasia. Such continuity requires stable cultural transmission and long-term social networks. Tiny, fragmented populations could not sustain this level of technological consistency for tens of thousands of years. Yet the Micoquian tradition has long been framed as simply another Neanderthal industry, a label that explains almost nothing. Once the enormous geographic spread of this technological system is examined closely, that interpretation begins to collapse. The same behavioral logic appears across widely separated environments and populations. Tools were curated rather than discarded casually. Raw materials traveled significant distances. Hunting strategies reflected planning rather than short-term opportunism. This does not resemble isolated bands barely surviving at the edge of extinction. It resembles a large interconnected human system spanning major sections of Eurasia. Crimea again sits directly in the middle of this network. From there, populations could move west toward Central Europe, east toward the Caucasus and Siberia, or south toward Anatolia and the Levant. The peninsula becomes difficult to interpret as peripheral once these broader connections are acknowledged. Instead, it begins to appear as one of the major interaction zones linking multiple human populations together. The wider fossil record reinforces this emerging picture. Sites such as Krapina in Croatia and Apidima Cave preserve individuals often classified as early or interglacial Neanderthals, yet many of these fossils display combinations of traits that blur the neat categories later imposed upon them. Some retain surprisingly modern facial structures. Others carry mixtures of robust and gracile characteristics that resist easy classification. The farther one moves into southeastern Europe and the eastern Mediterranean, the more unstable the traditional boundaries become. This instability creates a profound problem for the simplified narrative that places all meaningful Homo sapiens expansion after 50,000 years ago. According to that framework, earlier excursions into Eurasia supposedly failed completely, leaving little lasting impact. Yet the genetic evidence demonstrates repeated contact between populations long before that period. The archaeological evidence reveals shared behaviors spreading across large regions. The fossils themselves display mixtures of anatomical patterns inconsistent with strict isolation. Crimea sits directly within the center of these contradictions. Climate cycles provide the mechanism that ties these pieces together. During warm interglacial phases, forests expanded and migration corridors opened northward. Human populations spread widely across Eurasia, encountering neighboring groups and exchanging genes, technologies, and behaviors. During colder phases, populations fragmented into regional refuges, becoming more isolated and in some areas developing the robust, cold-adapted anatomy later associated with classic Neanderthals. But the underlying networks never vanished completely. Contact pulsed across Eurasia repeatedly as climates shifted. This perspective transforms the meaning of symbolic behavior in Crimea. The ochre associated with Kiik-Koba was not an isolated anomaly. It fits naturally within a broader pattern extending from the Levant into southeastern Europe. Burial traditions, social symbolism, and long-term planning were already spreading through interconnected populations long before the traditional Upper Paleolithic explosion. The people occupying Crimea were not primitive holdovers awaiting replacement. They were active participants in a wide human world already experimenting with complex behavior. The implications extend far beyond one peninsula. If Crimea functioned as a stable overlap zone between populations, then southeastern Europe itself must be reconsidered. Rather than a sharp frontier separating Neanderthals from Homo sapiens, the region begins to resemble a broad interaction belt stretching from the Balkans through the Black Sea region and into Western Asia. Population boundaries shifted constantly. Interbreeding occurred repeatedly. Technologies spread across group lines. The distinction between Neanderthal territory and modern human territory becomes increasingly artificial. This broader framework also resolves several long-standing contradictions in paleoanthropology. The Levantine Homo sapiens sites no longer appear as isolated, failed experiments. Instead, they become southern anchors within a larger interconnected Eurasian system. The gracile populations of Crimea no longer appear anomalous. The Micoquian technological network no longer looks provincial or isolated. The repeated appearance of symbolic behavior across widely separated regions becomes easier to understand once populations are treated as connected rather than sealed apart. The old image of Europe as sparsely populated by tiny, isolated Neanderthal groups also becomes difficult to sustain. Cultural continuity lasting tens of thousands of years demands stable population networks capable of transmitting knowledge across generations. The archaeological density visible in Crimea and surrounding regions points toward repeated occupation and enduring social systems rather than fleeting survival. Human groups moved across these landscapes continuously, responding dynamically to climatic changes rather than existing as static, isolated populations. Genetics increasingly supports this vision of a crowded and interconnected Ice Age world. The discovery that Neanderthal populations already carried earlier Homo sapiens ancestry before the famous later admixture events completely alters the timeline of interaction. Population contact in Eurasia did not suddenly begin around 50,000 years ago. It had already been unfolding for immense spans of time. Once this is accepted, many supposedly anomalous fossils suddenly make more sense. Mixed anatomical patterns stop appearing mysterious because the populations themselves were mixed. Crimea therefore stops functioning as a marginal curiosity and instead becomes one of the most important testing grounds for understanding early Eurasian population structure. Its geography, fossils, tools, and burials all point toward long-term interaction rather than isolation. The peninsula reveals a world where populations expanded and contracted repeatedly with climate cycles, where symbolic traditions spread earlier than expected, and where human identity was fluid rather than sharply divided. Something else emerges as well. The deeper this evidence is examined, the harder it becomes to maintain the image of neat evolutionary succession. The older story imagined separate human species occupying rigid territories until one suddenly replaced another. But the archaeological and genetic evidence increasingly points towards something far more complicated and far more human. Ancient Eurasia was not divided cleanly into isolated evolutionary boxes. It was a shifting mosaic of populations meeting, mixing, competing, adapting, and exchanging ideas across enormous distances. The Crimean evidence captures this reality with unusual clarity because the peninsula occupies such a strategic geographic position. It was never simply Europe or Asia. It was a connective tissue between worlds. During warm periods, people moved through it naturally. Herds crossed its plains. Technologies traveled its corridors. Ideas spread alongside migration. The symbolic burial traditions visible there were not random sparks appearing in isolation. They formed part of a much larger behavioral transformation already unfolding across Western Eurasia. Once this broader interaction belt is acknowledged, the entire structure of the old expansion narrative begins to weaken. The Levant no longer appears as a narrow staging ground for a single later migration. Instead, it becomes one node within a vast human landscape stretching deep into Europe and Asia. Crimea becomes another node within that same system, preserving evidence of populations who already carried complex behavior, broad mobility, and mixed ancestry long before the conventional timeline places them there. The ancient people buried at Kiik-Koba were not waiting passively for history to begin. They were already living within it. They buried their dead intentionally. They used ochre with symbolic meaning. They maintained sophisticated technological traditions across wide territories. Their anatomy reflected mixture and adaptation rather than rigid categories. Their world was crowded, dynamic and connected, and perhaps that is the most unsettling implication of all. The farther the evidence spreads across southeastern Europe and the Black Sea region, the harder it becomes to preserve the comforting simplicity of sharp boundaries between ancient humans. The story emerging from Crimea is not one of isolated species separated neatly upon a map. It is the story of overlap, movement, contact and continuity across a deeply interconnected Ice Age landscape where the lines between populations were never as clean as later theories preferred to imagine. Thank you for watching. If this journey into the ancient landscapes of Crimea changed the way you think about early humans, make sure to subscribe and follow along, because the deeper we look into the archaeological record, the stranger and more interconnected the human story becomes. There are still countless forgotten sites, overlooked fossils, and buried contradictions waiting beneath the surface, and each new discovery pulls us farther away from the simple narratives once treated as unquestionable truth.